The elevator dinged as Clara stepped off, adjusting her blazer and trying to suppress the rising sense of dread in her chest. She knew what was waiting for her on the other side of the glass doors. She had fought her way to this moment, fought against the doubts and whispers that had dogged her ever since she'd landed the position at McAllister Enterprises, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. But today was different. Today, Clara would face the man who had built his empire on the backs of others, on people like her. As she passed through the front office, her gaze briefly flicked to the polished marble floors. The cleaning crew had been working diligently, wiping up spots, making everything spotless. No one said anything when she walked by. They never did. When Clara entered the CEO's office, the air shifted. Donald McAllister, tall, immaculate in his sharp suit, stood behind his desk. He looked at her without a trace of warmth, only a cold calculation. "I don't have time for your excuses. Clean faster. We don't have all day." Her throat tightened. His words hit like a slap, his tone dismissive. But Clara had heard enough. Her hands clenched into fists under the table. "I've cleaned enough," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the thick silence. Donald's eyes narrowed, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smirk. "Excuse me." Clara met his gaze, her heart pounding, but there was something stronger in her now. "I said I've cleaned enough. You're not going to make me work harder because of who I am." The weight of his stare deepened, and the moment hung in the balance, electric with tension, as his hand slowly reached for the phone. The elevator dinged as Clara stepped off, adjusting her blazer and trying to suppress the rising sense of dread in her chest. She knew what was waiting for her on the other side of the glass doors. She had fought her way to this moment, fought against the doubts and whispers that had dogged her ever since she'd landed the position at McAllister Enterprises, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. But today was different. Today, Clara would face the man who had built his empire on the backs of others, on people like her. As she passed through the front office, her gaze briefly flicked to the polished marble floors. The cleaning crew had been working diligently, wiping up spots, making everything spotless. No one said anything when she walked by. They never did. When Clara entered the CEO's office, the air shifted. Donald McAllister, tall, immaculate in his sharp suit, stood behind his desk. He looked at her without a trace of warmth, only a cold calculation. "I don't have time for your excuses. Clean faster. We don't have all day." Her throat tightened. His words hit like a slap, his tone dismissive. But Clara had heard enough. Her hands clenched into fists under the table. "I've cleaned enough," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the thick silence. Donald's eyes narrowed, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smirk. "Excuse me." Clara met his gaze, her heart pounding, but there was something stronger in her now. "I said I've cleaned enough. You're not going to make me work harder because of who I am." The weight of his stare deepened, and the moment hung in the balance, electric with tension, as his hand slowly reached for the phone. The elevator dinged as Clara stepped off, adjusting her blazer and trying to suppress the rising sense of dread in her chest. She knew what was waiting for her on the other side of the glass doors. She had fought her way to this moment, fought against the doubts and whispers that had dogged her ever since she'd landed the position at McAllister Enterprises, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. But today was different. Today, Clara would face the man who had built his empire on the backs of others, on people like her. As she passed through the front office, her gaze briefly flicked to the polished marble floors. The cleaning crew had been working diligently, wiping up spots, making everything spotless. No one said anything when she walked by. They never did. When Clara entered the CEO's office, the air shifted. Donald McAllister, tall, immaculate in his sharp suit, stood behind his desk. He looked at her without a trace of warmth, only a cold calculation. "I don't have time for your excuses. Clean faster. We don't have all day." Her throat tightened. His words hit like a slap, his tone dismissive. But Clara had heard enough. Her hands clenched into fists under the table. "I've cleaned enough," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the thick silence. Donald's eyes narrowed, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smirk. "Excuse me." Clara met his gaze, her heart pounding, but there was something stronger in her now. "I said I've cleaned enough. You're not going to make me work harder because of who I am." The weight of his stare deepened, and the moment hung in the balance, electric with tension, as his hand slowly reached for the phone. Clara adjusted the strap of her purse, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and high-end cologne in the air as she stepped out of the elevator. The polished marble floors of McAllister Enterprises gleamed beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting, the shine almost blinding as she passed through the gleaming atrium. She quickly masked her discomfort, forcing herself to appear composed as she walked past rows of empty cubicles and sleek, minimalist desks, her heels clicking against the polished surface like a drumbeat signaling her arrival. The air in the building was always the same, sterile, immaculate, untouched by anything that felt human. It felt like a world she didn't belong in, a world that expected her to remain unseen, unnoticed. But Clara had learned to adapt. She'd spent 2 years proving her worth in this corporate jungle, working her way up from the mailroom to assistant manager in one of the most prestigious companies in the city. She wasn't here by mistake, she wasn't here by luck. She had earned every single inch of her position. She passed the cleaning crew on her way to her desk. They were already at work, sweeping, mopping, wiping down the glass doors, scrubbing away invisible stains that only a keen eye would ever notice. Clara did her best not to acknowledge them, as they had learned to do with her. A glance, a polite nod, nothing more. The dynamics between them were clear. She, an assistant manager, and they, the invisible workers, meant to keep the world in pristine condition but never acknowledged for their efforts. As she reached her cubicle, Clara noticed it was unusually quiet. No one was at their desks, and even the hum of the copy machine was absent. "Must be a slow morning," she thought to herself before sitting down, glancing at the clock on her screen. The meeting with Donald McAllister, the CEO, was scheduled for 10:30 a.m., a full hour before her usual duties kicked into gear. The nerves in her stomach churned. She had seen him in passing several times, but this was the first time she was expected to speak directly with him. Her mind wandered as she organized her desk, preparing for the meeting. What would he want with someone like me? She wondered. What could I possibly have to offer? But she pushed those thoughts aside. "I belong here," she reminded herself. She had worked hard to earn her spot. And yet, a part of her, an insistent, anxious part, whispered that the moment would come when her identity would be questioned, when she would be reminded that she was different. And that would be the moment she would need to prove that it didn't matter. The clock ticked, and Clara finally heard the sound of footsteps approaching. A group of her colleagues walked past her cubicle, chatting idly. She recognized a few of them, the junior executives who had started around the same time she did. They were all white, their laughter filling the hallway as if they were entitled to the space they inhabited. She felt a pang of isolation as she looked at their carefree faces. Then the door to the office opened with a soft click. Donald McAllister emerged from his lair, a towering figure in a sharp, tailored suit. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention even in the most ordinary of settings. Clara stood up immediately, the reflex almost instinctual. "Ms. Diaz," McAllister said, his voice smooth but clipped. His gaze swept across her, barely registering her existence beyond the formalities. "You're early." He didn't wait for a response, continuing his brisk pace down the hallway, expecting her to follow. Clara's heart pounded as she walked behind him, keeping her steps light but deliberate. "Belong here. I belong here," she repeated in her mind like a mantra. They entered his office, a sleek, minimalist space filled with expensive furniture and art that made the room feel cold and impersonal. McAllister strode behind his desk, settling into his chair without so much as a glance at Clara. She stood for a moment, uncertain, before sitting in the chair across from him. The silence stretched for a moment, thick with unspoken expectations. McAllister didn't even glance up from his desk, his fingers tapping against the surface rhythmically. It was as if he was waiting for her to speak first, as if he didn't believe she had the courage to challenge the invisible boundary that separated them. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice casual, almost dismissive. "I don't have much time," he said, still not looking up from his papers. "We have a lot to get through today. Let's make this quick." Clara felt a flare of irritation, but she swallowed it down, forcing her tone to remain even. "I understand, Mr. McAllister," she said, striving to keep her voice steady, professional. He looked up at her then, eyes narrowing slightly, as if noticing her presence for the first time. "You should," he muttered, "if you want to keep up with the pace around here." The comment hit her like a slap. He wasn't speaking to her as a colleague. He was speaking to her as though she were something beneath him, a mere cog in the machine. He might have been the CEO, but she was still a person. And yet, in this world, it felt like that didn't matter. His eyes glinted with a superiority that made her blood boil. "Clean faster," he added, his voice low and contemptuous. It wasn't a question. It was an order. Clara blinked, her mouth going dry. Clean faster. Was he seriously telling her to clean the office, as if her job were to scrub the floors or wipe down the surfaces instead of contributing her expertise to the company? She stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. This is it. This is the moment, she thought. This is when I decide who I am. Who I am willing to be in this space. Slowly, Clara set her jaw. She leaned forward, meeting McAllister's gaze. "I've cleaned enough, Mr. McAllister," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You're not going to make me work harder because of who I am." McAllister's eyes widened for the briefest second, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He didn't expect her to speak back, let alone with such defiance. His lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The room was thick with tension. Then, without another word, McAllister's hand slowly reached for the phone on his desk. The soft click of the receiver felt like a gunshot in the silence between them. The next few weeks at McAllister Enterprises passed in a haze for Clara. The quiet indignities continued to stack up. Small, casual dismissals, dismissive glances, and the same jokes that weren't funny the first time and only became more painful with repetition. But she had become adept at compartmentalizing, focusing on her work and ignoring the subtle mockery that clung to the edges of every interaction. It wasn't until the big presentation that the pressure she had been holding inside finally erupted. Clara had spent days preparing for this presentation, crafting a proposal for a new marketing initiative that she believed could not only improve their company's outreach but also provide a competitive edge in the marketplace. She had poured herself into it, sacrificing evenings and weekends to make sure it was perfect. This was her chance to prove herself, to finally be seen for the value she brought to the company beyond her role as the assistant in the room. The conference room was packed. Senior executives, department heads, and, of course, Donald McAllister himself, all sitting around the sleek conference table. The air was thick with the hum of whispered conversations, the low clatter of laptops being opened, and the distant sound of the elevator bell as other employees trickled in. Clara stood at the front, next to the projector, doing her best to mask the storm of nerves swirling in her stomach. She had already noticed how her colleagues looked at her differently in the room, some with mild interest, some with barely concealed skepticism. Most of the men exchanged quick glances, as if silently communicating some unspoken rule about who got to take the lead in these situations. Clara knew she was fighting not only to be heard but to be believed. When she began her presentation, her voice was steady, but a nervous tremor betrayed her in the first few sentences. She couldn't help it. Her heart was pounding, and she could feel her palms sweating against the clicker in her hand. "This proposal," she began, forcing herself to meet the eyes of each person in the room, "will enhance our digital marketing strategy by utilizing data analytics to improve customer engagement. We can tailor our messaging to target niche markets that—" Her words were cut off by a loud snicker from the back of the room. She glanced toward the sound, her heart skipping a beat, only to see Greg, one of her colleagues, laughing to himself. It was a brief, dismissive chuckle, nothing overtly cruel, but the intent was clear. You don't belong here. Clara's mind whirled. It wasn't the first time Greg had made her feel small in front of the team, but it was the first time it had been so blatant. She paused, briefly losing her place in the presentation. Her pulse raced, but she took a breath and continued. She had worked too hard to let a snide comment derail her. As she clicked to the next slide, Clara was struck by a sudden, intense wave of exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from the burden of constantly trying to prove that she belonged, that she was worthy of the same respect given to everyone else in that room. Her voice grew quieter as she spoke, and by the time she reached the end of the proposal, she had lost her audience. The men were half paying attention, scrolling through their phones or talking among themselves. McAllister had his arms crossed, eyes narrowed, looking at her with the same faint disinterest he always wore. "Thank you," Clara finished, her voice faltering. "I'll take any questions." A silence followed. It was thick, oppressive. No one said anything for a moment, and Clara's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had put everything into this presentation, and yet she felt invisible. She couldn't help but wonder, if she had been white, if she had been male, would things be different? Finally, McAllister spoke. His voice was calm but carrying an edge that made Clara's skin prickle. "It's not bad," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But it's too ambitious. This market doesn't want to be bombarded with analytics. People want simple, straightforward campaigns. We need to scale it down." His eyes flicked to Greg, who was now nodding in agreement. "Tom, you have something more practical." Tom, another junior executive, straightened in his seat, eager to chime in. "I think we could cut out some of the unnecessary data points and just focus on the basic strategy. More streamlined. Less." He paused for effect, clearly searching for the right words. "Less complicated." Clara bit her lip. Her idea was being dismissed not for its merit, but because it was too ambitious. 'Cause it was hers. Tom's suggestion wasn't just simpler. It was watered down, reduced to the same tired approach they had always relied on. No risk, no innovation. And yet he was the one getting the credit. "Right," McAllister said. "I think that'll work. Let's have Tom revise the proposal and get it ready by the end of the week." He glanced over at Clara, his gaze barely acknowledging her presence. "You can clean up the data and help Tom with the revisions, right?" Clara's heart thudded in her chest. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice almost too quiet. McAllister raised an eyebrow. "You heard me. We'll need your expertise to support Tom's work. You can take care of that, can't you?" The words were like ice water, a cold slap to her face. It was clear now. It didn't matter how hard she worked, how well she performed. She was still just the one who cleaned up the mess, the invisible worker who made everything look perfect while the men reaped the rewards. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The frustration, the anger, the years of silently enduring this kind of treatment, all of it bubbled to the surface, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile, but her voice was strained tight. "I'll take care of it." The meeting wrapped up shortly after that, and Clara gathered her things in a daze, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Her proposal had been dismissed, not because it wasn't good enough, but because she wasn't good enough. In the quiet of her office, Clara sat down at her desk, staring at her computer screen. Her pulse still raced. This wasn't just about the presentation, it was about something bigger. She had been silenced again, pushed aside, relegated to the background as she always was. But this time was different. She had reached her breaking point. "I'm done being the invisible worker," she thought. "It's time to fight for my place here. No more playing by their rules. I'll rewrite the script. I'll make them listen." Clara stood up, her heart pounding. This wasn't just about a presentation. It was about her future, and she wasn't going to let them take it from her. As Clara left the office that night, a spark of defiance lit within her, bright and unyielding. Tomorrow, she would start the battle that had been a long time coming. The war for her dignity, for respect, for a seat at the table where her ideas truly mattered. Clara didn't go back to her apartment after that meeting. She couldn't. The anger that had simmered inside her was a constant presence, and she needed to keep it moving, keep it alive. She couldn't afford to sit in her quiet, lonely apartment and let it fester. Not this time. So instead, she found herself walking the streets of the city, her mind racing, replaying every moment of the meeting. McAllister's dismissive words. Tom's eagerness to tear down her work. The way they had casually relegated her to the background, like she was nothing more than an afterthought. But as she walked, something shifted in her. The usual frustration started to give way to clarity. Clara knew she couldn't let this slide. She had spent so many years navigating this corporate world, smiling through microaggressions, staying quiet when her ideas were stolen or dismissed, when she was excluded from decision-making, when her presence was minimized. But it had gone too far this time. It's time to fight, she thought. The problem was, Clara didn't know how to start this fight. She couldn't just burst into McAllister's office and demand justice. She was well aware of the risks of going rogue. She was no fool. A woman like her didn't have the luxury of being impulsive. The stakes were too high. She couldn't afford to get fired. She couldn't afford to lose her job in a world where jobs like this didn't come around often for people who looked like her. So what was her move? That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the invisible boundaries that had been placed around her. The doors that had always been half open, just enough to keep her hoping, just enough to make her work harder and harder to get through. But the doors were never wide enough to let her walk through them with the same ease that her white colleagues did. As she lay in bed, the weight of those microaggressions from the last few years suddenly felt unbearable. Maybe it's not just McAllister, she thought. Maybe it's the system itself. Maybe it's the way this whole company functions. The next day, Clara came into the office earlier than usual, feeling a quiet resolve settle over her. She had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. She sat down at her desk, booted up her computer, and immediately started taking stock of everything. All the incidents, all the little things she had brushed off in the past. The comments, the silences, the ways in which her contributions were minimized or taken from her. She kept meticulous records, dates, names, quotes, and made a spreadsheet of every microaggression she could remember. The small betrayals, the moments when she'd been passed over or made to feel small. The things that didn't seem worth fighting for on their own, but when put together, painted a picture of the company's deep-seated racism. The list grew longer the more she worked on it. A microaggression here, a dismissive glance there, a stolen idea here, a comment about her background there. Each one was a drop in the bucket, but together, they formed an undeniable pattern. She was being treated differently because of the color of her skin. And McAllister, as much as he tried to keep his distance, was at the top of that pyramid, a product of the system that kept people like her in their place. He had been the one to give her the silent orders. Clean faster, take care of this, help Tom with the revisions. But he wasn't the only one. There were others who stayed silent, who watched as he dismissed her, and who said nothing. They were complicit, either by inaction or by choice. Clara wasn't sure what to do with the list yet, but it felt empowering to have it. It gave her a sense of control, something she hadn't felt in a long time. By mid-morning, Clara's mind was racing. She couldn't just stay in the office and wait for an opportunity to present itself. She needed to take action, even if it was a small one. Her first step was to have a conversation with Tanya, one of the few women in the company she had begun to trust. Tanya had been in the marketing department for years, and though they didn't work directly together, they had spoken before about their shared experiences as women in a male-dominated field. But recently, Clara had begun to notice Tanya's reluctance to get too close. The distance between them had grown, and Clara could feel the weight of the unspoken pressures pressing down on her. As Clara walked into the break room, she found Tanya pouring herself a cup of coffee. Clara hesitated for a moment, then walked up to her. "Tanya," Clara said softly, her voice steady but hesitant. "Can we talk?" Tanya looked at her, a flicker of something in her eyes. Either fear or caution, Clara couldn't tell, but she nodded. Sure, what's up? Clara waited until they were seated at a table, away from prying ears. I'm not sure how to say this, but things have been happening in this company that I can't ignore anymore, she began, her voice low, measured. Microaggressions, disrespect, and it's not just me, it's happening to others too. I know it's not easy to speak up, but I feel like we're letting it slide. And it's hurting us. Tanya's eyes flicked nervously around the room, as though she were weighing the risks of what Clara was about to say. I've seen it, Tanya admitted quietly. I've seen how they treat you. And I've seen how they treat other women and people of color. But Clara, you have to understand. The system is bigger than us. If we speak out, it's not just our jobs, it's everything. It could ruin our careers. Clara swallowed hard, nodding. She had already considered this. She knew what the consequences could be. But she also knew that staying silent was no longer an option. I know, Clara replied softly. But if we don't speak out now, nothing will ever change. This company, this system, it'll keep treating us like we don't matter. And I refuse to be part of that anymore. Tanya stared at her, a long silence hanging between them. Finally she sighed. All right, Tanya said. I'm with you. But we have to be smart about it. We have to gather evidence. We need a plan. Clara felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Slowly, they began to map out their next steps. They would work together, document everything, and build the case. It would take time, but it was a start. As Clara returned to her desk that afternoon, she felt a shift within herself. She wasn't just an employee anymore, someone invisible in the system. She was a person with power. And that power came from the truth. The quiet rebellion had begun. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But it was real. And it was hers. The atmosphere in the office had shifted. Clara could feel it the moment she walked in that morning. The usual hum of activity was replaced with a nervous energy, a collective holding of breath, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. She wasn't sure if it was because of her meeting with Tanya the day before, or because of the undeniable tension that had been building ever since McAllister's dismissive treatment of her. Either way, Clara felt it in her bones. Something was coming, and it was going to be big. Her thoughts were a whirlwind as she sat down at her desk. The evidence was mounting. Her list of microaggressions was growing, and Tanya had shared similar stories of her own experiences. The quiet rebellion they had started together was beginning to take shape. But Clara knew it couldn't stay quiet for long. The truth had to be spoken. McAllister had to be held accountable for his actions, for the way he had used his power to diminish her, to belittle her, to pretend that she didn't matter. It was just after lunch when she got the call. Clara, McAllister wants to see you, her assistant Emily said, her voice tight with unease. Now. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The call had been short, no pleasantries. No explanation. She felt a knot form in her stomach as she stood up and grabbed her notebook. She had been anticipating this moment, preparing for it in her own way, but now that it was here, the weight of it felt heavier than she had imagined. Walking through the halls, her mind raced with every possible scenario. She wasn't naive. She knew McAllister didn't call her to praise her hard work. This was going to be another battle. Another test of whether she could keep her resolve in the face of his power. The CEO's office was on the top floor of the building, and Clara felt the familiar chill of distance between her and everyone else as she made her way up. No one stopped her, no one spoke, but she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. Whispers followed her every step. When she reached McAllister's office, the door was already open. Clara stepped in without knocking, just as he had instructed her before. McAllister didn't look up immediately. He was staring at a pile of documents on his desk, tapping his pen against them in a steady rhythm. His cold demeanor was as suffocating as always. When he finally looked up, his eyes were sharp, assessing. "Have a seat," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. His voice was calm, but the underlying tension was impossible to ignore. Clara sat down, her back straight, hands resting firmly on her lap. She didn't speak. She was done with pleasantries. "You've been making waves, Clara," McAllister said, his voice even. "I've heard things. People are talking." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she held his gaze. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. The moment when she would no longer stay silent. "I don't think you realize what you're doing," McAllister continued, his eyes narrowing. "This kind of behavior could hurt your career. And it's not just me. You're starting to upset people in this company. People who have been here a lot longer than you." Clara felt a surge of anger, but she kept it contained. This was the moment to strike back, not with emotion but with facts. She was done being scared of the consequences. McAllister's intimidation tactics didn't work on her anymore. "I'm not the one causing problems, McAllister," Clara replied, her voice steady but firm. "The problem is the way people like me are treated in this company. The way you treat me and everyone else who doesn't fit your idea of what's acceptable. It's been happening for years, and I'm done pretending it's not." McAllister's face hardened, but Clara didn't back down. She wasn't the scared little assistant anymore. She had a voice and she was going to use it. "You think it's about the things you've experienced, don't you?" McAllister scoffed. "You think this is about race or gender or whatever label you want to put on it. But the truth is, it's about one thing, your performance." Clara's eyes narrowed. "My performance has never been the issue. I've delivered results every single time. I've proven myself time and time again. And yet you treat me like I'm disposable. Like my ideas don't matter. Like I'm not worthy of respect." The words hung in the air between them, charged with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. McAllister stared at her, his lips pressed tightly together, but Clara could see the flicker of something behind his eyes. Maybe frustration, maybe fear. He wasn't used to people challenging him like this. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. "You don't understand how this works, Clara," he said, his voice now laced with irritation. "I'm the one who decides what's best for this company, not you. You don't get to dictate what happens here." Clara leaned forward, her tone growing colder. "I don't want to dictate anything, McAllister. I just want to be treated with the same respect that everyone else in this company gets. I want my contributions to be acknowledged. I want to be seen as an equal, not as someone who has to fight for every inch of space I'm allowed to occupy." McAllister stood up suddenly, walking around his desk, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You think you can challenge me and get away with it. You think you can change the way things are around here. You're nothing but a cog in the machine, Clara. And you're about to find out that machines don't need cogs that don't work." The threat was clear, but Clara didn't flinch. She knew what he was doing, trying to make her doubt herself, trying to break her. But it wasn't going to work. Not anymore. "I've had enough," she said, standing up to face him. "I'm not asking for permission anymore. You can't intimidate me into silence. And I'm not the only one who feels this way. You'll see soon enough. This company won't be able to ignore it forever." The room was silent for a moment, charged with the weight of what had just been said. McAllister stood there, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with anger, but Clara didn't flinch. She had said what needed to be said. She had drawn the line. As Clara turned to leave, she could feel the shift in the air. It was palpable, like a storm on the horizon, ready to break. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was ready. The fight had begun. And this time she wasn't backing down. Clara stepped out of McAllister's office, her heart racing, but a sense of calm washing over her. She had faced him, confronted the power he had over her, and she had come out standing tall. The battle was far from over, but it had started, and that was enough. Now the real fight would begin. The days that followed Clara's confrontation with McAllister were a blur of tension, whispers, and a growing sense of change. The small rebellion she had started was no longer something that could be swept under the rug. The evidence was there, and the momentum was building. It didn't take long for people to notice the shift. The atmosphere in the office felt different. Colleagues were no longer avoiding her gaze. Some even began to speak up, offering support in quiet, subtle ways. Clara had expected this moment to feel more like a victory, but instead it felt like the calm before the storm. The storm she knew was coming, and the storm she had to face head-on. McAllister was not the kind of man to let anything slide, especially not a challenge to his authority. Clara had braced herself for the inevitable backlash. But what she didn't expect was how quickly things escalated. Started with a simple email. The subject line was innocuous enough. Upcoming meeting, a standard company update. But when Clara opened it, she was hit with a chilling sense of déjà vu. The email was a formal request for her to clean up the data for a project, a task that, under normal circumstances, she would have been happy to assist with. But the way the email was worded, detached, impersonal and condescending, made her blood run cold. It was a clear, calculated attempt to belittle her again, to remind her of her place in the hierarchy. It wasn't just the tone of the email. It was the timing. It came right after the showdown in McAllister's office, just as the dust was beginning to settle. This was no coincidence. This was a message from the top. Don't get too comfortable. You haven't won anything. Clara's hands shook as she read the email. She wanted to ignore it, to continue on with her day and pretend that it didn't matter. But it did. She knew it did. The humiliation of being reduced to the role of a cleaner, the reminder that no matter how hard she worked, her value was never going to be recognized, it stung. But Clara didn't let it defeat her. Instead, she decided to take a different approach. This time, she wouldn't just fight back silently. She would make her voice heard loud and clear. Later that afternoon, Clara sat down at her desk and composed a response. The words came easily, as if they had been building up for weeks. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She didn't apologize for speaking out, or for challenging the status quo. She was done with apologies. Mr. McAllister, she typed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this project, but I believe my role and contributions should be valued in a way that reflects my expertise. I am no longer willing to accept the role you've assigned me. I've proven myself time and time again. My skills and ideas are worth more than the task you've outlined. She paused for a moment, her cursor hovering over the send button. There was a part of her that hesitated, that feared the backlash. She knew this could be the beginning of the end, that McAllister wouldn't take kindly to being called out. But the truth was, Clara didn't care anymore. She had come too far to turn back. With a deep breath, Clara hit send. The feeling of liberation was immediate, but short-lived. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was from Emily, her assistant. Clara, are you sure about this? Emily's voice was shaky. I just saw the email. He's not going to let this go. Clara sighed, her grip tightening on the edge of her desk. I don't care anymore, Emily. I've spent my whole career playing by their rules. I'm not going to do it anymore. If McAllister wants a fight, he's going to get one. She could hear the hesitation in Emily's voice, but before she could respond, Clara hung up. There was no turning back now. The fallout came quicker than Clara had expected. Within hours of sending the email, she received a terse response from McAllister. I don't appreciate your tone, Clara. We'll discuss this in person. Her heart sank. She knew what was coming. McAllister was a man of power, and when his authority was challenged, he didn't back down. But Clara wasn't backing down either. She had made her choice. The next morning, McAllister called for an emergency meeting with the executive team. Clara was summoned to attend. The sense of dread that filled her as she walked into the conference room was almost suffocating. The entire executive team was there, their eyes focused on her as she took a seat at the far end of the table. McAllister stood at the head, his presence commanding the room. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to sit tall, to look him in the eye, to not let the fear take over. I've called this meeting because we need to address some concerns, McAllister began, his voice cold. Clara has taken it upon herself to question my leadership, and the way things are run here at McAllister Enterprises. This is not acceptable. Clara's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She knew what was coming next. McAllister would try to discredit her, to make her out to be a troublemaker, someone who didn't understand the company's culture. He would try to turn the room against her. But Clara had prepared herself for this moment. She had already made her stand. "Mr. McAllister," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I didn't question your leadership. I questioned the system that you've allowed to thrive here. I question the way people like me are treated. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for respect." There was a long, tense silence in the room. Clara could see the flicker of anger in McAllister's eyes, but she stood her ground. "You've built this company on the backs of people like me," she continued, "and I won't be silenced anymore. Time for change is now. If you want to fire me for speaking the truth, then do it. But I won't go quietly." McAllister's face tightened, his jaw clenched. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a voice interrupted. "Actually," said a voice from the back of the room. It was Tanya. Clara turned, surprised to see her standing there, her eyes full of resolve. "I've been here long enough to see this happen again and again. And I can't stay silent anymore either." Clara's heart skipped a beat. Tanya had stood up. Tanya, the one who had been hesitant, had finally found her voice. One by one, others began to speak. Some of them were quiet at first, but Clara could hear the change in their voices, the sense of solidarity building in the room. The truth was out, and there was no going back. McAllister's empire was beginning to crack. But Clara knew that even though the battle had begun, it was far from over. The stakes were higher now, but for the first time, she felt the power of the truth on her side. And that truth would be her weapon. The system was about to change, and she was ready for the fight. The days after the meeting with McAllister and the executives felt like a blur to Clara. The storm she had started had only intensified. Her email, the one where she had refused to accept McAllister's diminishing role for her, had ignited a firestorm, both inside and outside McAllister Enterprises. Within the company, the quiet murmurs had grown into open discussions. Her stand had forced the topic of racism and inequality to the forefront, but it wasn't without its cost. McAllister was furious, and his attempts to isolate Clara only made her more determined. It wasn't long before Clara found herself in the company of lawyers, sitting in their cold, sterile offices as they discussed the specifics of her case. Tanya had been the first to approach her with the idea of taking legal action, something Clara had been hesitant about. She hadn't wanted to go public to risk the scandal. But as the days wore on, it became clear. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about changing the system. Clara's phone rang one afternoon. It was Tanya. "Clara, they've started the investigation. McAllister's camp is trying to settle out of court. They're offering you a deal," she said, her voice tense. Clara's heart sank. She had known it was coming. The companies like McAllister Enterprises didn't want these things to go public. But she had made her decision. "I'm not taking it," Clara said firmly. "I didn't start this fight to take a paycheck and walk away. I want the truth out there. I want accountability." Tanya hesitated. "It's not that simple, Clara. If you don't settle, the legal battle could drag on for years. You could lose everything. Your career, your reputation, it could all be ruined. You know that, right?" Clara's grip tightened around her phone. "I know, but I'm not afraid anymore. If I let them win this, I'll never be able to live with myself. I have to see this through." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and paperwork. Clara was living in a constant state of stress, each new day bringing more pressure. McAllister's team of lawyers tried every tactic they could think of to undermine her case. They questioned her integrity, twisted her words, and tried to paint her as an oversensitive employee who couldn't handle the demands of corporate life. It was a strategy designed to break her, to make her doubt herself, to make her question whether this fight was worth it. But Clara stood strong. She knew that she wasn't alone. Her voice had started to resonate within the company. Others, who had once been silent, now began to come forward with their own stories. By the time the case was officially filed, Clara had gathered a network of support. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been treated the way she had been treated. The invisible workers, the women, the people of color who had been pushed to the sidelines. The media attention was quick to follow. It was impossible to ignore the story now. The headlines splashed across the internet, television, and print. Whistleblower exposes racism at McAllister Enterprises. The company, once considered untouchable, now found itself in the public eye for all the wrong reasons. Clara had expected some backlash from her colleagues, but nothing could prepare her for the full scale of the fallout. Some of her co-workers, the ones who had once quietly supported her, now distanced themselves. There were hushed conversations in hallways, cold stares when she passed by, and a pervasive silence that lingered wherever she went. But it was the words of her fellow women and colleagues of color that kept her going. In interviews with the press, she was able to hear the stories of those who had been treated just like her. Marginalized, pushed aside, their contributions dismissed. They thanked her for having the courage to speak up, for doing what they hadn't been able to. That was the fuel that kept her moving forward, even when her own future seemed uncertain. One morning, Clara sat in a small conference room at the courthouse, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. The room was filled with her legal team, Tanya by her side, and the opposing attorneys from McAllister Enterprises, their expressions tight and serious. McAllister himself was absent, but the feeling of his presence loomed large in the room. "We're ready to proceed," Clara's lead attorney said, looking over the papers in front of him. "This is it. The deposition will begin, and we'll present everything we've gathered. We have a strong case, Clara. You've done everything right." Clara nodded but felt a knot in her stomach. She was ready, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play here, something that extended far beyond her personal case. This was about every worker who had been made to feel invisible, every person who had been told their voice didn't matter. As the door opened and they called her name, Clara stood up, her hands trembling slightly, but she steadied herself. She had fought too long to turn back now. The courtroom was as cold as she imagined it would be. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, called the proceedings to order. Clara sat in the witness chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart beating faster as she prepared to speak the truth. Her attorney began the questioning, and for the first time in a long while, Clara found herself speaking openly, without fear. She talked about her experiences, about the microaggressions, the dismissive treatment, the way her work had been undermined because of her race. She spoke about McAllister, about the meeting in his office, about the moment she had decided to stop being silent. She didn't hold back. Every word that left her mouth felt like a victory, like the weight of years of oppression being lifted, one sentence at a time. She could see the reactions from the jury, the subtle nods, the shifting in their seats. They were listening. They were hearing her. But it wasn't easy. The defense attorneys threw every question at her, trying to paint her as a disgruntled employee, a troublemaker who was simply upset because she didn't get her way. They tried to discredit her story, questioning her integrity, implying that she had fabricated her experiences. But Clara stayed firm, never wavering. When the defense rested, Clara felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The fight wasn't over yet, but she had done what she had come to do. She had spoken the truth, and now there was no going back. As the days turned into weeks, Clara's case continued to unfold. McAllister Enterprises was facing not only legal consequences but a growing social backlash. Their reputation was tarnished, and the public pressure was mounting. The final moments of the trial approached, and Clara knew that whatever happened next, she had already won. The system had been shaken. McAllister had been exposed. His empire cracked open for the world to see. But Clara also knew that the true victory was not in the courtroom, not in the settlement or legal fees. The true victory was in the voices that had been raised, in the changes that were coming, in the future where no one would be forced to stay silent. As she walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and journalists, Clara finally allowed herself a smile. It was small, but it was enough. She had fought for herself, and for everyone who had ever been silenced. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt truly free. The days following the final verdict were a blur. Clara had expected closure, but what she felt was something entirely different. A strange mix of exhaustion, relief, and a bittersweet sense of victory. McAllister Enterprises had lost. It wasn't just a legal loss, it was a moral one. The company had been forced to pay a settlement, one that would help fund diversity initiatives and make tangible changes in its hiring practices. But the price for McAllister's empire wasn't just financial. It had cost him his reputation, his control, and, in many ways, his power. Clara sat in her apartment one evening, a glass of wine in her hand, watching the news. It was surreal, hearing the story of her own case being broadcast, replayed on every major channel. Headlines read, "Corporate giant McAllister Enterprises faces legal reckoning over racial discrimination," and "Whistleblower Clara Diaz leads battle for workplace equality." But Clara didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who had simply fought to be seen. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up to see a message from Tanya. "They're doing a feature on you tonight. You should watch." Clara smiled faintly, a tightness in her chest. The last few months had felt like a roller coaster, and she had barely caught her breath. But as she watched herself speak on the news, something inside her shifted. She wasn't the same person she had been when she started this fight. She had gone from someone quietly trying to fit in, to someone who demanded to be heard. The news anchor's voice came through the screen. "Clara Diaz, the employee who challenged McAllister Enterprises on issues of race and workplace equality, has become a symbol for those demanding change in corporate America. While McAllister Enterprises has paid a hefty settlement, Diaz's victory extends far beyond the courtroom. Her case has sparked national conversations about systemic racism in the workplace and has encouraged more employees to speak up against discriminatory practices." Clara leaned back in her chair, taking a slow sip of wine. She wasn't sure if she could still believe it all. A year ago, she had been just another face in the office, dismissed and minimized, fighting against a system built to keep people like her silent. But now her name was everywhere. She had become part of a movement, even if that wasn't something she had ever intended. The changes inside McAllister Enterprises were swift, but not as immediate as many had hoped. While the settlement was significant, it was clear that the company's leadership wasn't ready to completely transform. They had implemented diversity training, changed their hiring practices, and promised to hold senior executives accountable. But there was something hollow about the promises. The lawsuit was over, and McAllister had taken his hits. But the system, the one that had allowed him to act with such arrogance, remained largely intact. Clara had learned that not all victories were wrapped in neat, tidy packages. There was no magic moment when everything clicked into place, no instant change. The work continued. The fight continued. Her own role at the company had shifted too. The moment McAllister was ousted, a vacuum had formed. Some senior executives had been let go, while others stepped down voluntarily to avoid further scandal. In the midst of the fallout, Clara had been offered a promotion, a seat at the table where she had been so often excluded. But the offer came with a catch. She was to lead a new diversity and inclusion initiative, a role that would demand her full attention and time. It was the perfect opportunity, but Clara hesitated. She knew what this position would require of her. It would take everything she had, and she wasn't sure if she could trust the system that had allowed McAllister to thrive in the first place. One afternoon, Clara met with Tanya in a small cafe near the office. She had been mulling over the offer for days, trying to decide whether to accept or decline. Tanya could see the conflict on her face as soon as she sat down. "So?" Tanya asked, her eyes hopeful but guarded. "I don't know," Clara said, stirring her coffee absently. "It's a good opportunity. It's the change I've fought for. But I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if they're really committed to it." Tanya nodded thoughtfully. They'll only change if people like you push them to. If you leave now, they'll just replace you with someone who'll play by their rules. But if you stay, you can make a real difference. You're in a position to change things from the inside. I mean, think about it, this is what we've always wanted, right? To not just survive, but thrive. Clara let the words settle in. Tanya was right, of course. She had been given a rare opportunity to change the system from within. She could either walk away, remain outside the machine, or step into the engine and try to steer it in a new direction. The choice wasn't easy, but for the first time, Clara didn't feel like the decision was out of her hands. I guess I always thought I'd have to leave to make a difference, Clara said softly. But now I see, I can make more change here than I ever could anywhere else. I can make them see. The next day, Clara walked into McAllister Enterprises, her decision made. She accepted the promotion but with clear terms. She would not be a token figurehead. She would have the power to implement real change. And if that meant confronting uncomfortable truths and upsetting the old guard, so be it. In the weeks that followed, Clara worked tirelessly on the new diversity initiatives. She pushed for transparency in hiring, for better opportunities for marginalized employees, for more comprehensive support systems. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always welcomed by the people at the top. There were those who resented the changes, who fought against her every step of the way. But Clara was undeterred. She had seen what the company had been, what it still was, and she refused to let that be the status quo. As she sat in her office one late evening, reviewing data and finalizing reports, Clara allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about the long, difficult road that had brought her here, the years of quiet endurance, the moments of doubt, the battles she had fought alone. But now she wasn't alone. She had allies, she had a purpose, and most importantly, she had a voice. The work was far from over, but Clara had learned something important. Justice wasn't always instant. It wasn't always pretty, but it was possible. And with the right people fighting for it, the tide could turn. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Clara felt the quiet certainty that she was on the right path. And that, she realized, was worth more than any promotion or paycheck. It was the kind of justice that stayed with you, long after the dust had settled. It had been 6 months since Clara accepted the position at McAllister Enterprises, a pivotal decision that had not come without its challenges. The company was different now, or at least it seemed different on the surface. The changes were visible in the diversity training, the recruitment initiatives, and the new policies designed to promote inclusion. But Clara knew better than anyone that the true test wasn't in the words or the posters. They were in the actions, the subtle shifts in the corporate culture, and the real power to effect change. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of her office, casting long shadows across the desk where Clara sat, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The room, still sterile and sleek, had become more of a sanctuary for her than it had been before. It was a space where she could work in peace, away from the noise and the tension of the battles she had fought. But even in the calm, Clara never forgot the price of this peace. She still remembered the day McAllister's resignation had been announced, a quiet affair with little fanfare. The media had covered the scandal extensively, but inside the company, it felt as though people were holding their breath, waiting to see how the leadership would shift. The board had quickly appointed a new CEO, someone who was more in line with the changes Clara had fought for, but the transition had been uneasy, and old habits died hard. There were still whispers, still reluctance to fully embrace the idea of systemic change. Clara's mind wandered back to that first day when she had been promoted to oversee the new diversity and inclusion initiative. The excitement she had felt then had been tempered by the overwhelming responsibility. She was tasked not only with implementing these changes but also with holding the entire company accountable, a daunting feat given the company's history of avoidance. She had pushed forward, unwavering in her belief that this was the work she had to do, that it was bigger than just her. But the weight of it sometimes felt suffocating. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Tanya. Meeting with the board this afternoon. They want an update on the inclusion metrics. Are you ready? Clara stared at the message for a moment, her mind racing through the data, the progress they had made, and the hurdles they still had to overcome. The numbers were better. More women in leadership positions, more people of color in upper management, increased awareness of microaggressions. But Clara knew the board wasn't interested in the numbers. They were interested in the optics, in whether this was a win for the company's public image. She quickly typed back a response. "Ready as I'll ever be. Let's do this." The boardroom was silent as Clara stood before them, the weight of her presentation resting squarely on her shoulders. She could feel the gaze of the board members on her, a few of them still looking at her with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. They hadn't expected a woman like her, a woman who had challenged the status quo, to be leading these efforts, but here she was, standing at the front of the room, ready to prove that the changes she was implementing were more than just lip service. She began her presentation with the usual statistics, the progress they had made, the diversity benchmarks they had met. It was a good start, but it wasn't the real point. Clara knew the board was looking for something more, something that spoke to the heart of the issue, something that showed them she wasn't just playing the game to appease the masses. "Diversity is not just a checkbox," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. "It's not about numbers. It's about creating a culture where every employee feels valued, where their voice is heard, and where they can contribute without fear of being dismissed, marginalized, or silenced. The numbers you see here are just the beginning. What we need now is a shift in the way people think, the way people act. We need to ensure that diversity is woven into the fabric of this company." There was a long pause after her statement, and Clara felt the weight of their silence. But she didn't flinch. She knew this conversation was necessary. It was no longer just about McAllister or the legal battle she had fought. It was about creating a legacy, about ensuring that what had happened to her, to so many others, didn't happen again. One of the board members, an older man with graying hair, cleared his throat and spoke. "I understand the importance of diversity, Clara. But how do we make sure this is sustainable? How do we ensure that the culture changes, not just the numbers?" Clara nodded. This was the real question, the one that went beyond policy or training. It was about changing the hearts and minds of people who had been operating under a system of inequality for years, sometimes without even realizing it. "We need accountability," she said. "We need leaders who are committed to making these changes, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's what drives our success as a company. It's about making diversity and inclusion a core value, not a trend. This isn't just a department initiative. This is the company's initiative." She let that hang in the air for a moment, watching as the board members exchanged looks. She knew they understood what she was saying. It wasn't easy to change the culture of a corporation that had been built on exclusion and power. But it was possible. And it had to happen whether they were comfortable with it or not. As the meeting came to a close, Clara stood up, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. The board members nodded, some offering polite smiles, others still deep in thought. They would need more time to fully embrace the changes she was pushing for, but the seed had been planted. She had done what she set out to do. When she returned to her office later that afternoon, she was met by a different kind of silence. The office was still and quiet, but it wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. The weight that had followed her for so long, the weight of constantly fighting, constantly challenging, had lessened. The work wasn't over, but Clara knew she had done her part. As she sat down at her desk and looked out at the city below, Clara felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The battle for equality was ongoing, and there was still much work to be done. But she had changed the narrative. She had made them listen. And that, Clara realized, was enough for now. The world was shifting, slowly but surely. And with every step forward, every conversation she started, every policy she helped implement, the future was becoming just a little bit more just. The fight for justice was never a straight path, but Clara knew one thing for certain. The fight would never end. And she would be there, leading the charge, until the very last battle was won.